How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast. Finally, the most saturated podcast in the world. Where your host is always myself, MickyT,
And me, nostalgia.
and it's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a
It has
very long
indeed.
time since we've actually got together and done a tape podcast. It's been months, actually. Now that I think about it. And to start, do you want to explain like what the deal has been and all that?
Yeah. Well, I think anyone who is familiar with the Tape podcast can already see that things are a little different. First of all, we're here on camera.
Yeah,
Layout's a bit different, and also new format for the actual episode itself because we're not doing a worst to best, and we're not going to be doing worst to best in podcast form anymore. Um, we explained it in more detail in our server, our reasoning behind that, and what we want to do with worst to best. So if you want to know what's going to happen with that series, join the Discord and check announcements. It'll be in there, but it's a bit complicated. Um,
yeah. I think just to make it long story
yeah,
short. I think we felt like the format that we were doing for taped was not really engaging for the viewer in a sense because we were doing like all our stuff like more structured and kind of in list format, like and not really
yeah.
doing it in a way that's kind of free flowing. And the more that we've like kind of went back and listened to these podcasts, and the more that we thought about it, they are a bit jarring structurally. They can be maybe a bit confusing for a new viewer, so instead, we've just opted to do something that's more kind of accessible for the viewer, something that's a bit more free flowing, something that I think would be a bit more engaging, and something that I feel like
I
we'll
think
be
it
able to.
is more conducive to conversation. Is
Yeah,
the
yeah,
big
it's
thing
definitely,
for me.
yeah, it's definitely more conversational, if
Hmm.
anything, and I feel like that would suit the format much better. And yeah, in that sense, we're still going to be covering discographies. It's still going to be the same old content about like music and all that sort of stuff, but just kind of just hitting a bit different in a sense,
Yeah,
if you get what I mean.
if anything, it's just the order that we cover these discographies in that'll be different.
Yeah, pretty much.
We're gonna be covering them all in chronological order, talking back and forth about each album. It won't be strictly me talking then Mick talking. Um, and yeah, I think it'll be more of a podcast rather than a show that probably would have needed visuals and some video editing to make any sense.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, we're both excited about it, and this is the first episode. It's an episode that we initially were going to do a bit worst to best on, but obviously we as we
we
discussed, we're
changed.
changing the format, and it happens to be the first of the new era of taped podcasts. Taped podcast
Yes,
season two.
season two. We'll dub it season two then.
Season two.
Season two of this weird little anime, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the so and the and first arc of this new anime, we're going to be talking about a little boy band that's been kicking it for a few years. Well, not any, well, not now, but like they were for a good while. And that, of course, is Brockhampton.
Let's
And
fucking go.
this is a very special one for both of us actually, because a little bit of TCT lore. That's actually how we kind of got to know each other, became friends, because
Mm-hmm.
we were setting up like a little kind of like get together when we first started college, and we were messaging on Instagram, and Miho noticed I had a little Brockhampton profile picture, and from there the music nerdum began, and here we
Yes.
are now,
Yes.
about 4 years later. Insane, dude.
Yeah, I mean, still to this day, Brockhampton are a really important group to me.
Yeah, same.
I mean, since the first saturation album dropped, they've been just ever present in my life.
Hmm.
Um, Rarely does like a week go by where I don't listen to Brockhampton. Like to this day, they're on heavy rotation.
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Actually, for like a decent while, they sort of fell out my rotation for the past year. But like going back into them, it's like, okay, yeah, the nostalgia trip is
hmm
happening, and it happened.
and yeah, I do get like I do get months sometimes where I don't listen as much, and then I'll just get like hooked back into it like crazy, and yeah, they're addicting.
They are, making pop bops and rap bops, all in there. Probably one of the biggest like kind of alt hip hop groups since like maybe Odd Future or something
Definitely,
like
yeah.
that.
I'd
Definitely,
say
kind of
the biggest
feeling.
since Odd Future.
Definitely, definitely. You know what? They thought that kind of clique of like artists kind of died out. hasn't it? When you
Yeah,
think about it,
yeah. I mean,
like there's not really many like that anymore, or at least there hasn't been for a while. We haven't really seen like a big like click like that.
mm, there are. The closest thing I guess we have is like all these labels that have a kind of unison style, but
Like Opium.
yeah, or even like something like 88 Rising. They released a few group projects,
Yeah,
like as a label.
yeah.
But yeah,
I haven't actually heard much from 88 Rising in ages. Now that I think about it, it's
yeah.
been a
I
long
mean,
time.
yeah, that was the first time I thought about them in a while.
Same actually.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, they were really kind of in a field of their own. The whole like rap group, one verse per rapper kind of thing, just isn't as big anymore. There's obviously, I mean, rap and features are just
so
completely
they go hand in hand.
coexistent.
Yeah,
But when it comes
but
to a
like
group, then yeah,
yeah, like groups and cliques or whatever, it's kind of like reduced to just labels pretty much. And yeah, and Brockhampton's kind of the last of its kind for now. Who knows what'll happen in the next couple of years? But yeah. So yeah, with that in mind, let's just get right into it. Let's talk Brockhampton. Talk about all these albums.
yeah. So again, we're going to be going through their discography, album by album, starting with their debut mixtape all the way to their most recent two projects. And that is the format going forward for Taped. We're going to be talking back and forth about each and every album. So let's kick it off with Brockhampton's debut mixtape, released in 2016, All American Trash.
Ooh.
Opening thoughts?
Um, for me, All American Trash is like a blueprint for what Brockhampton would be going forward because there's hints and like ideas there that would eventually make Brockhampton who they are later on down the road. But the issue is, it's just they're not really fully formed yet. Like I think the members are really just trying to find their style, trying to find their personality, trying to stand out in their own particular way, and some of them are just kind of struggling to find their personality. I felt particularly like Matt, Merlin, and Joba kind of struggle to stand out that much on this mixtape in particular. And like it's an okay mixtape generally. Like it leans a lot into like alt hip hop and kind of like Frank Ocean R&B type stuff, and it's an interesting blend of pop rap as well in there. But the ideas and sounds they would typically be working for, like they're there, but it's obviously, like I said, not fully formed. Um, there are tracks on this album they're actually pretty good though. I will say, like I think I really like the track Ben Carson, and I think Palace is definitely one of the best tracks in the album as far as like standout moments go. But I wouldn't say there's a bad track minus like Flip Mo maybe. I mean, Flipmo literally just sounds like Merlin is trying to do his best, like, I don't know, Yeezus era Kanye song. It's kind of funny. And aside from that, I can't really say I have too much else to say about it because, like, All American Trash is just kind of like I said, a starting point rather than like its own kind of fully fleshed out project.
Yeah, we often say that about like debut albums, where in a lot of, I mean, there's some obvious exceptions where a debut album is just a masterpiece right out of the gates. But when it comes to debut albums that kind of showcase the artist, finding their footing, I think All American Trash is probably one of the most obvious examples of that. The sound here is very recognizably Brockhampton, but it
Yeah.
is also very much not up to par, quality wise, with what they would go on to release just a year later. Um, that being said, I actually think it is pretty solid, and parts are honestly pretty underrated. I think tracks like Ben Carson, I think tracks like Michigan, I think are on par with some of the cuts on the Saturation trilogy. I genuinely really, really enjoy them. There are some very awkward moments like Flipmo, like Mosscliff, that really I don't think would have even been considered for any of the Saturation albums. It really does feel like the band just kind of experimenting, trying things out, and that's what this album is. It's nothing more. I do think it's got enough highlights for me to call this basically a bit of an essential, borderline. I do think that the highlights are definitely worth checking out, and for anyone kind of interested in the formation of Brockhampton and how the Saturation trilogy came to be, I think it's a really interesting like bit of context listening to this and you know, hearing how much they grew in just a year. It really, I think, adds to the impact of the Saturation trilogy. So I respect and I enjoy it for what it is, and there's definitely some cuts that stand out, but overall it is definitely kind of just the early rumblings of what would be.
Yeah. I think the best way I can describe it is it's a work in progress. That's what I'd say.
Yeah. An
And yeah,
experiment that was
and it,
recorded in a way.
yeah,
Let's
kind
see
of,
what we
kind of.
can do here.
There's like a little like short documentary behind All American Trash that's on YouTube. I think it's more so just like home video stuff, pretty much. But it's pretty interesting. Yeah, with that in mind, a couple of my favorite tracks from it were Ben Carson and Palace, and of course my least favorite was Flipmo.
Yeah, my favorites were Ben Carson and Michigan. My least favorites were Mosscliff and Flipmo.
Poor
Rating?
Merlin. For me, I'd probably give it a strong 5 out of 10.
I'd give it a light 6, slightly higher. Because
Fair enough,
again,
fair enough.
those highlights are genuinely really good.
They are, I will say. I actually didn't mention Michigan. I should have. It's actually
Yeah,
very good.
I love it.
Yeah. And now we move on to the fucking big boys in the Brockhampton discography. And that's the Saturation trilogy. And we're going by each album, like, specifically. But, yeah, we're going to start with Saturation 1. And opening thoughts.
What an album. To this day, what an album. What a statement of intent. Immediately right off the bat, starting their studio album discography with Heat. I don't think they could have started with a more like, look at us, this is what we are.
Literally.
Fucking buckling. Yeah, it's night and day in terms of quality between this and their debut mixtape. It, as I said, is a statement of intent, especially with its opening track, opening it with such a ferocious, braggadocious, and like in-your-face track, and then immediately following up with one of the coolest and like most not flamboyant. What's the word? Gold. What's the word? Just eccentric and flashy songs in their discography. Immediately the band were like, let's play our strong cards first and let's show everyone what we're capable of. And I think, yeah, this album right off the bat means business.
Yeah, it does. It really does. Heat just fucking sets you up for it, man. Holy shit.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, just what a way for a band to really just say, here we are. This is Brockhampton. And like, fucking hell, Saturation is fucking great. And Saturation, it just feels like they are fully formed. Like at this point, like everyone is really standing out on their own, have their own personality, have their own flows and all that. And they just gel really well together as well. The synergy is insane between all the members and on the various cuts, and like they're all distinct as well. Like you will be able to pick out like each members based off of their own, what they do. Like you're never going to mistake fucking Dom for Kevin. You're never going to mistake Choba for Merlin. Like there's they have their own distinct personalities, and it really makes the album pop more. Especially considering how strong like the track list is. Like, come on, you got Gold, you got Star, you got Heat, you got Waste. Like, there's so many brilliant tracks on this album. It's insane, and some of which are like some of the best tracks that Brockhampton ever made. Yeah. And obviously, their sound at this point, it's fully formed. Like, mix of pop rap, a bit of abrasive cuts in there as well, and they just hit so much better in contrast with All American Trash because like the performances are better, the writing is better, the production is much better, and they're just more memorable and more complete. And genuinely, the first like 3 tracks is like one of the best runs in there.
Yeah, it's probably insane. I can't think of any. Does anything rival Heat, Gold, and Star? I mean, that's crazy to start your discography off with that.
Yeah, I think for comparing it to the albums, maybe the closest would probably be like the other 2 Saturations. That's the thing, but like I think Sat 1 has the best like opening 3 tracks out of any Brockhampton album.
And I would say Heat is my favorite Brockhampton song to this day. So to start off on that is just, it gets me pumped every time I go through their discography. It's There's no better way to get pumped, and it's like right off the bat, the band's like, yeah, our debut mixtape was just a dress rehearsal. This is the
This
real
is the
deal.
act. This is the
Um,
final act.
yeah, brilliant.
Yeah. I do have a bit of a gripe with Saturation 1 though, personally. And over time I feel like Saturation 1 has kind of lost its flair for me as far as like the middle section goes. But and to be honest, it's probably my least favorite in the Saturation trilogy. But that means nothing when all the saturations fucking slap. And Sat 1 is great anyway because its best tracks are like just so good.
Mm-hmm.
And for me at least, like I think it stands strong as one of their best albums. I mean, come on, like it's saturation.
Yeah. Uh,
But
yeah, I do think I do agree that the middle section is probably the weakest section of the album, and it is kind of front and back loaded. But I do think there's some interesting cuts in there as well. As far as how I would compare it to the others, it definitely isn't my favorite, but I also would hesitate to say it's my least favorite. It's probably on par with two. I mean, if you asked me in 2017, I probably would have said it's more so on par with my favorite of the three, Saturation 3. But I do think that time has been a bit kinder to the other two and a bit less kind to this one. And I
yeah,
think it's mostly to do with that middle section, which does see the boys kind of experiment a little, try some more off kilter stuff, stuff that is less focused, less to the point than obviously the first three tracks. But I do think a lot of it is still very much enjoyable.
yeah, I agree. But also just forgot I have to mention the last two tracks in the album is like the one of the best 1-2 punches to finish off the album. Like,
Yeah,
come on, you got face like before waist. Like, what the fuck?
yeah,
Like that
no,
is just an
brilliant.
unbelievable like 1-2 punch of final tracks. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I agree.
I will stand by the point though that the middle section hasn't really aged as well. But again, like the front portion and the back portion really do make saturation great. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in agreement here in terms of our opinions. I think I can echo everything you said.
yeah, and so yeah, my favorite tracks from saturation specifically, gold has to be there, star has to be there, heat as well, face and waste. And if I had to pick a least favorite, it would be milk.
My favorites, Heat Gold Star, obviously. Um, Bump is super underrated. Swim is super underrated, and then Milk, Face, Waste, the last three. Least favorite, probably Bank. Just doesn't really stand out as much to me.
Fair enough. Fair
It's
enough.
catchy, but
Yeah,
it
yeah,
just doesn't live up.
of course. And yeah, we're moving on to the next Saturation album, Saturation 2. This is my favorite Saturation album. And it has been since I first heard it. Oh my god. For me, Saturation 2 just has all the bops. And I feel like it appeals. I think, in contrast with Saturation 1, I think Sat 2 definitely appeals to the hip hop primary listener. I think. That's the way that I see it. And I feel like that's why it appeals to me the most. Because, I'm a hip hop head at heart, but like the songs on here are so strong, it's insane. It's just bop after motherfucking bop. It's so good to me. And it's been my personal favorite Brockhampton album for years, specifically. I've loved this thing. I just feel like it's one of the tightest and most concise Brockhampton albums. I think just the writing is much better. The production, like it gets a bit more zanier than Saturation One, and I feel like it works to his benefit because the beats on this thing are insanely memorable, insanely unique. And as well as that, I feel like the hook writing is really like what drives this record too, because there's so many amazing hooks in this thing. Like I think the hook for Swamp has been stuck in my head for years, and I cannot get rid of it. I love it so much. There's amazing individual verses on here as well. There's so many catchy hooks and flows. I feel like it's a bit more. I think it's distinct in when we compare it to the other Saturation albums. And there's just so many fun bangers on this album, as well as like more kind of serious and intense moments too, like Junkie, which is probably the most, if not one of, if not the most intense Brockhampton song that you'll probably hear. And yeah, it's all incredibly consistent for me. Like pulling up the track list now, there's just so many tracks here that I love. And when I go back into the album, it's like I'm just having so much fun. I can't help myself. And yeah, it's definitely my favorite Brockhampton album for sure. It's been for years, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also love this album. I love the entire trilogy. I think sound palette wise, it is already a bit of a deviation from what we hear on Saturation 1. I think that the band already kind of sound more focused in on what they want to achieve, more focused in on the sound, and which is impressive given there's only a few months between them. But I will say, I think the peaks on Saturation 1 are slightly more frequent than the peaks on Saturation 2, whereas I think the consistency is more evident with Saturation 2. I think that's probably the best way I can put my opinions on these two albums, because it's mostly love, and any gripes I have with them are me really grasping at straws. But yeah, I think there's seldom a dull moment on this album. There's not really any skips. There's not really many moments that feel out of place, undercooked, overcooked. It's just a really consistent, just banger after banger after banger showcase of the band's talents and abilities. And yeah, it's not my favorite Saturation project, but I definitely see why this is a lot of people's favorites, given it is kind of like the banger fest of the trilogy. And yeah, I also do have to give a special shout out to Junkie, one of the highlights of the entire trilogy, of their entire discography. Kevin's best verse ever, in my opinion, and one of Matt's best verses as well. If only Dom's verse was a little longer, but
Of course,
we got
yeah.
what we got.
We get what we get. There's no going back. Like, we have to accept it. But
Yeah,
I think I can get what you mean with Saturation 1, saying that the highs are probably higher than Sat 2. I'm
more
kind of torn.
consistently. I do think it was kind of unfair on tracks like Summer and Junkie to say that as like a blanket statement, but
Yeah,
I do. It's margins, but I would prefer Face. I would prefer Heat, Gold. Maybe not over Junkie, but over maybe Summer or Gummy or some of the other highlights.
yeah. It's like I'm kind of the same way with Saturation too, because like there's days where I'll prefer Swamp or Queer or Gummy or Summer or Sweet over a bunch of tracks in Sat 1. Like I'm kind of in the same boat in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
So I get what you mean, but they're still great albums anyway. And what would you rate it out of 10?
Um, Same as Saturation 1. I'd give it a decent 8.
It's a light 9 for me.
Fair play, fair play. Speaking of light nines, for me, spoiler alert. I thought you would. I
No,
should
no,
probably
no, no.
introduce. It would make more sense if I introduced it after saying that.
Yeah,
My bad.
I look, we're new to this format. We'll get used to it.
Yeah. Saturation 3, the finale of the trilogy, and in my opinion, the band's magnum opus. I think this album is their creative peak. I think it's their most complete album, and I also think it's the most consistent album they've ever released. I think it takes everything I love about Saturation 1 and 2 and just perfects it, while also experimenting in like ways that I wouldn't have seen coming otherwise. I feel like tracks like Sister Nation or Boogie work perfectly on Saturation 3, but would have felt a little off on previous albums, like out of nowhere. But I think this album is just out there in its out there on face value. It's out there for everyone to see, and it does whatever it wants to. And the crazy thing is, it perfects everything it tries. Like the beat switch on Sister Nation is just ridiculous. Like,
It is. Oh my god.
it's crazy
Oh my.
that
It's so
it
good.
should never work. I don't think
But
anyone
it
in their
works.
right mind would attempt it. It works perfect. It's perfect. And not even a beat switch. The beat on the first half, it's like crazy. It's
you know
a
what? It's
crazy
like
thing to rap over.
it is. It's like something fucking Death Grips would have made back in the day. Like,
Yeah.
it's insane.
It's wild. Yeah, and I also do appreciate the fact that Joba is really let allowed to shine here. He's given more of a platform to express himself. He was a bit more on Saturation too, but like this is really, I feel like Joba coming into his own, and he's not just the falsetto guy.
And going forward, that would be the case as well.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, he showcases what he's able to do, and I think the entire band showcases the best of them, including producers. Again, Sister Nation, I have to point that out. It's fucking a ridiculous track.
literally, it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
Like, it's so good. Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. And in terms of verses, I think every member on here is on absolute top form. There's not really a weak verse or weak hook on this thing. Production is just stellar throughout. It is, in my opinion, one of the best rap albums of the last 20 years.
it's just another great addition to the Saturation trilogy. Like, all in all. But like, if you thought like it couldn't really get any more kind of zany than like some of what Saturation 2 presented, well, you're dead fucking wrong, because it literally opens with Boogie. Like, what the fuck? It's actually like one of the most like chaotic and most just zany tracks they've ever made, and it's one of their best openers by far. And like, there's just it's so good. Oh my god! But obviously, they bring forth the zaniness, but they also bring forth some of their most kind of unique ideas. Bring forth some of their most catchy, like melodic tracks. Think of like Bleach, Rental, and Team. And the highlights are just unbelievably good. Some of the greatest tracks that Brockhampton ever made. Like, are you fucking kidding me? Sister Nation, Rental, fucking Boogie. There's so Zipper as well. Actually, I think is one that gets a bit outshined somehow. Well, it's so good. I love it so much. It's just a quirky little tune, and it goes off. And each member has their own like brilliant individual moments as well. I think particularly Dom and Joba have some brilliant moments in this. It's really fun. It's a brilliantly fun listen. There's loads of brilliant tracks on it, and it kind of throws you for a loop in context with the Saturation trilogy. But I think an issue that I have with it is actually a similar issue that I have with Saturation 1. And I feel like the middle section, minus Bleach, isn't as inspired as the rest of the tracks for me personally. And that might be a hot take. I don't know if it is, but that's just kind of something that I noticed every single time I went back and listened to Saturation 3. Like, I think I remember telling you years ago, it's probably my least favorite in the trilogy. But obviously, since then, it's grown on me and all that. And the years have been kinder to Saturation 3. But I still kind of hold that middle section as just a little bit lesser than like maybe the front and back half. Kind of similar to Saturation 1, but obviously not as like noteworthy as Saturation 1, if you get me.
Mm-hmm. I love the middle section. I love every track on there. So I'll agree to disagree.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, it's my favorite Brockhampton album. If we were doing worst to best, this would be the last album I was talking about. We've got plenty more to go. We should do best and worst tracks for Saturation 2 as well. Saturation 3. We completely forgot about
shit.
that. Yeah.
Forgot about Sat 2. Okay, favorite tracks from Saturation 2.
I'm just going to do 3 from now.
I'll just do a bunch of them. So Gummy, Queer, Swamp, Tokyo, Junkie, Sweet, and Summer. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would probably be Gamba.
My favorites are Junkie, Sweet, Summer. My least favorite is Fight.
And before we go to best worst tracks, give a score for Saturation 3.
Light 9. Yeah, I said at the beginning, light 9.
Oh, honestly, decent 8 for me.
Light to decent 9. Light to decent 9.
Fair enough. Decent 8 for me. And yeah, some of my favorite tracks, some highlights from Saturation 3 for me were Boogie, Zipper, Bleach, Rental, and Team. If I had to pick a least favorite, it would probably be Hottie.
Oh, I love Hottie. My favorites are Boogie, Sister Nation, and I need to give a shout out to what I think is maybe the most underrated Brockhampton song, Alaska. I think it's like a top 10 Brockhampton song for me. I absolutely love it. And least favorites, none. Really none. Cinema 2. Fuck it.
Actually, which Saturation had the best Roberto skits?
I feel like I don't know. I feel like when I think of them, I think of the Saturation 1 ones.
I think it's that one too.
Yeah, I think I'll say that.
Okay. Okay, now that's done with the Saturation trilogy. Now we're going to move on. And I think before we talk about iridescence, I think we should provide context, which is very important for not just iridescence, but for the group going forward, really.
Mm-hmm.
Because like this basically what happened in between Saturation 3 and Iridescence pretty much changed everything for Brockhampton. Like not only because obviously they got signed to a big major label, but also because allegations came out about one of the group's members, Amir Van, and he was subsequently kicked from the group since then. And it was a moment that they didn't really recover from in as far as like I suppose the emotions go, because remnants of that like have been kind of sparked through their discography since then, kind of coping with that and kind of some themes around that. But it happened, and we got Iridescence and everything else after that. And Iridescence is there. It was when they signed to RCA when this album came out, and it brings forth like some of the band's most experimental ideas while also acting as one of Brockhampton's more emotionally intense albums. It does have like some of the best parts that make Brockhampton special as a group. But I think for the album, ultimately, the fact that some members feel kind of distant from this is kind of evident, and kind of scattered, and there's kind of a fracturedness to this album, and for obvious reasons, like, and I wouldn't hold it against them. The songs that are great on this album for me, they're truly some of the band's greatest tracks, like Way, Jover, San Marcos. As well as that, I think some of Brockhampton's most interesting and cool production choices come in. And there's loads of very blown out mixes, loads of experimental, versatile moments. Plus, it has some of the group's most like emotionally intense moments in the discography. I think, especially from Kevin and some of the verses that he says in the album. And pretty much every instance of Joba's verses too. Joba was it was it was intense from Joba, really.
He was a machine
And,
on this album.
yeah. With that being said, there are tracks that that don't really connect with me as much and kind of feel underwhelming in regards to the performances. For example, I think Berlin and Honey especially, and I like it as an album and what it represents for Brockhampton's discography. But for me, it's never been an album I rated as highly as like every other Brockhampton fan has, because I know loads of people love this album. I know it has its critics as well, including myself. But that's just how I feel about it. Like, it's a really good album. I just feel like some of it isn't really up to snuff. But like, given like everything that happened, like there's a good reason why.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the consensus about this album is extremely mixed. I fall on the side that thinks this album is incredible and one of the best. Obviously, yeah, as you mentioned, the whole Amir Van situation it's basically the only reason we got this album. There was basically another album called Puppy. It was ready to go. Everything I've heard from it, and there's like a lot of there's a few like fan made compilations of what Puppy would have sounded like, and it would have been on par with Saturation. It would the three tracks that they officially did release without Amir are all brilliant, and completely different to what we got in Iridescence. It is evident that this album was sort of the band back to the drawing board, trying to find themselves again. They obviously lost musically they lost a pivotal member of the group, and replacing him was always going to be impossible. So I think it's evident here that they're not trying to replace him. Instead, they're trying to maybe showcase different sides of themselves to add a new dynamic. And I think again a lot of that does come from Joba. I think Joba sort of becomes the new kind of aggressive force in Brockhampton, the new kind of in your face to the point force in Brockhampton in a way, and his flows again are nothing like Amir's. I think there's no one else in the band who matches Amir's energy, and because of that, I think the band did kind of seem like they were just trying things that they probably wouldn't have tried before. Tracks like Something About Him, I think San Marcos as well in a way, probably wouldn't have existed in a Puppy album or any Amir album. And I think there's something special about the sound of a band sort of trying to find themselves again and doing it in such an honest, at times aggressive, frustrated way. And I think that's what this album is. It's kind of the birth of a new Brockhampton. It's, in a way, I do kind of see the why people would not gravitate to this album as much, why they would find it a hard one to listen to. But I do think that it's an important album in their discography without a doubt, and it's also a very effective one. I think the experimentation, I think it's their most experimental album, and I think the experimentation really does add an interesting dynamic to the band's already existing dynamic. I think the way the performances are so off kilter, and the way the instrumentals just completely kind of toss and turn with new ideas constantly, it makes for one of the least predictable albums in their discography, and that's saying a lot, considering that the band was never afraid to try something new. But I think it's an admirable album. It's one that I think on release I was absolutely in love with. I would have, if you asked me in 2018, I probably would have held it in the same regard as Saturation 3. But I think over time, there are some tracks that I don't return to as much. But despite being so experimental, despite being such an abrasive moment in their discography, I do think it has to be said that it has some fucking bangers on there.
It does, for
Some
sure.
tracks that, I mean, live up to some of their best moments, their best hits, and overall, I think it's a super underrated album, and I think it's one of their best.
Okay, agree to disagree then. Like, I still think it's good though. I think it's a good album, like an important one for sure. I just kind of feel disconnected from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
with that in mind, like, what would you rate it out of 10 actually?
I would give it a decent 8, same as Saturation 1 and 2.
I'd give it a decent, like, decent 7. And yeah, with that in mind,
Tracks, best and worst tracks.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Okay.
But
I thought you were going to move
you
on.
don't know me. You don't know
I
me.
guess I don't.
But yeah, New Orleans, Jauvert, San Marcos, Thug Life, and Vivid. Vivid is super underrated in my opinion.
True.
If I had to pick a least favorite, it would be Where's the Cash At?
My favorites are Wait, Jauvert, and Tanya. I don't really have any of these favorites. I think Where the Cash At is probably the closest to least favorite, but it's like a strong 6.
Holy shit, I forgot to mention Wait. What the fuck?
Wait, wait. Everyone knows Wait. Yeah.
Okay.
Decent 8.
All right, fair enough. And now we're moving on to their album they released after this, and it is Ginger. Is it fair to say Ginger is somewhat divisive? Like in the
Yeah, I
Brockhampton
think
fandom?
both. I think like if you, even if you look at the Rate Your Music scores, I think I know it's not the end all be all, but compare it to the Saturation trilogy, both Ginger and Iridescence are fairly divisive.
Yeah, they are. They are, and like it's easy to see why. And I could see why with Ginger too. I think people. It's a weird way to say it because Brockhampton were still kind of having a moment where they needed to come together and kind of regain who they were as people. And I think that's what culminated into Ginger. And I feel like there was like a moment where people were just kind of getting sick of that, I suppose, and that's why it could be divisive. Because like Ginger, like it's not the most depressing album ever, but it is fairly depressing. Like it's a kind of a what's the word? I'm trying to think. Anyway, never mind. But it is definitely one of their more kind of down albums.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I've always loved Ginger. I felt like it was one of my favorites from Brockhampton, actually. Probably my favorite of theirs after the Saturation trilogy. And I've always ranked it highly. I've been a big defender of this album since it came out. And for me, it was kind of a return to form. And I think they kind of brought back the synergy that made me love a lot of their previous work. And I think that it really shows with a lot of the tracks on you. But at the same time, the band were still struggling. They were still healing over the events that transpired years ago. And generally, I think they made a worthwhile album out of it. I think they made bangers for sure. Obviously, Boy Bye, St. Percy, If You Pray Right, I've Been Born Again. I love the more emotional cuts like Big Boy, No Halo, and Dearly Departed. And while I do think the last leg of the album is a bit weak in comparison, I love the closing track. I mean, Victor Roberts, which is a very interesting moment where they just get someone else to kind of spill their guts over a song, the aforementioned Victor Roberts, and I think it's really I think it's like a perfect like ending to the album personally. And also, I forgot to mention Sugar. That's probably the biggest Brockhampton song, and it's sweet as fuck. I love it. I won't hear it otherwise. And I feel like each member does have brilliant moments to stand out. You know, Joba especially, and Dom especially. And I have fun with the banger tracks. And as a healing album, I think it's effective and stands out on its own in Brockhampton's discography. I can certainly get some of the hate and maybe the more divisiveness, kind of similar with Iridescence, I suppose. But generally, it's been one that I've loved a lot over the years, one I still come back to sometimes, and has some of my favorite Brockhampton songs on it. And yeah, that's just how I feel about Ginger.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think Ginger to me feels like the yin to Iridescence Yang. It's sort of opposite, completely opposite in its sound, as in it's probably the band's most commercially accessible album, as opposed to Iridescence, which is exactly the opposite. But it does kind of deal with similar themes, which is why I do feel like, I think personally I kind of clump them together despite the fact they sound completely different.
I do
Um,
too. I do too sometimes. Like, because they're both like two sides of an emotional coin,
mhm.
if you get me.
Yeah, and I think Iridescence is an album that sort of represents the raw emotions and frustrations and pain that the band felt, whereas Ginger to me feels like an album of growth, of retrospection and sort of acceptance. Um, and yeah, I definitely respect and love it in the same way I love Iridescence for that, and how it kind of chronicles the band's feelings and emotions at the time. Um, but I think overall it might be of the kind of golden era of Brockhampton from Sat 1 to Roadrunner, it's probably my least favorite. Which is not saying a lot because I called it the golden era for a reason.
Yeah.
I think it's got some absolutely great moments, but it definitely does feel like the band's most polished and safe album in a lot of ways. I think there's some like really quirky and interesting moments like Boy Bye. But overall, yeah, it definitely. I mean, Sugar is a perfect example. It's a great track, but it's their biggest hit for a reason. It's very easy to see why. Um, but I do kind of respect the fact that the band wanted to, sort of do something a bit more polished, a bit less raw, kind of spend more time in the studio perfecting a sound, after the kind of spill your guts moment that was Iridescence. But I think the highs, while they are there, just don't really live up to the highs of albums like the Saturation Trilogy, Iridescence, Roadrunner. I think they're great. I think they're memorable, but I think they're a tier below. And to me, apart from No Halo, it doesn't really have those like super defining, like career defining moments. It just to me feels like the bit of a safe, a bit thoroughly enjoyable, but just not really outstanding moment in their discography. It's really an album that I see myself coming back to the singles more than the full album from start to finish. That being said, I still think it's quite good. It's very good even. I'm just comparing Brockhampton albums to Brockhampton albums, so it makes
I
it
mean,
sound worse than it is.
I kind of have to disagree with like the defining moments part. I think Dearly Departed alone
Yeah,
kind of sets
again,
that precedent.
I think, yeah, I don't think it lives up to some of their better tracks. I think it's great, but it's not in the 10
I
out of 10 track territory for me, which they
I
have a
don't
lot of.
I don't particularly agree, to be honest. I feel like there are tracks in here that kind of stand up as some of their best, like Dearly Departed, and even
Mm.
some of the even if we were talking about kind of some more banger tracks, I'd even argue like Saint Percy and maybe If You Pray Right.
I
That's
mean,
I'd
they're
argue that.
yeah. I think
I'd
they're very
argue that.
good. It's just again, all those tracks I'd give like an 8 out of 10. There's several cuts off basically all their other albums that I'd give a 10 to easily.
Agree to disagree then.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what was your score for it?
Strong 7.
A decent 8 for me. And with that in mind, some of my favorite tracks from Ginger: No Halo, Sugar, Boy Bye, Saint Percy, Dearly Departed, Big Boy, and Victor Roberts.
Mine were No Halo, Boy Bye, and Dearly Departed. My least favorite is Love Me for Life.
All right. And with that, we have Roadrunner, New Light, New Machine up next. And this was an interesting little deviation for Brockhampton because, like, maybe aside from Iridescence, they didn't really get that experimental since. Obviously, Ginger, you mentioned, was definitely a bit more accessible, but they kind of went back to doing that on Roadrunner because it's probably their most stylistically all over the place album. And there's a lot of experimentation in here too. There's particularly some G-Funk influence on the track Don't Shoot Up the Party. And then they're also kind of bringing in their kind of mix of usual stuff like hip hop, like some kind of pop rap stuff, getting a bit more accessible. I think there's arguably some hip house influence on one particular cut here as well, and it's stylistically all over the place. And I've said that since it came out, but I feel like it works because I feel like the tracks on this thing are great. I think that there's some brilliant standouts as well, and it's also interesting to see them kind of work with different artists as well, like kind of bringing more in. I know they kind of did that as well on Ginger, but this time they feel more kind of ever present, I suppose, because there's Danny Brown, there's JPEG Mafia, there's ASAP Rocky, ASAP Ferg, Charlie Wilson, and so on. There's definitely a good collection of artists here, but at the same time, they don't take away from what the boys do in this album, and I think it works. It's definitely rougher in terms of production of it. There's lots of kind of production choices that definitely kind of hit kind of a DIY kind of aesthetic, and it makes sense because COVID happened like before that time, and there was a lot of albums coming out that was doing that DIY stuff, kind of that aesthetic, kind of that rough around the edges kind of appeal, and Brockhampton were just kind of another group kind of chiming in on it, and I think it works. And for me, I think the bangers on this album are incredible. I think Buzzcut is one of their best openers. I love Bankroll. I think Chain On is like a really kind of unique kind of moment as far as like their production goes. I love Don't Shoot Up the Party and Windows. I think it's great. I love the more hookier and I think I actually no. I feel like there's good hooks on this, but I feel like the kind of more pop centered tracks could be a bit better. I think, for example, it was released as a single. What was it called? I can't
Count
remember,
on Me.
but I think so. Yeah, I think tracks kind of like that could have been a bit better. And as well as that, you're also going to be hit with the occasional like kind of intense and kind of dark moment, like for example, The Light, which the subject matter is very fucking heavy on that song, and it's very intense. But it makes for one of their most heart wrenching tracks. I do think the majority of this album is great. I think some members bring their best performances, like Kevin, Joba, and Dom. And it's cool to see Jabari get on the mic in some occasions here because primarily a producer, but it's cool to see him kind of step up. And yeah, while I do think there are tracks here that are a little weaker in comparison, and while I do think there's not as many like consistent highs as say the previous couple of albums, I do think that the highs are great and that they're worth listening to. And I think the album generally is an interesting little deviation. I still really rate it to this day. I like it, and yeah, it's just another great album from Brockhampton, their golden era. I still really love it to this day.
Yeah, right assessment. I feel like this album has. It feels a lot more important than it did upon release. Now that we know what the band's last two albums look like, it does kind of feel like the last chapter in the Brockhampton story. And it's also kind of it's a difficult album. As I mentioned with Ginger, it felt like an album where the band were really healing. And obviously this album, I think, is sort of fueled and centered by the grief that Joba was facing due to his father's suicide. It's ever present even throughout the bangers. If it feels like the thought is just lingering in your head when you're listening to this project. I don't know if it's just me, but it does make me feel a little anxious and just like it's yeah, it's a heavy album for sure. Its bangers, as you said, aren't really as memorable, which maybe adds to that. But I think the introspective moments, the more experimental moments, and I'll take it back about the bangers. The more commercially accessible tracks like "Count on Me," for example, don't really live up. There's bangers here that live up.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
confused for a moment when
yeah,
you
yeah.
said that. I was like, what
That's
the
that's
fuck?
that's more so what I meant, and I am mostly looking at "Count on Me" as well. Yeah, it's I'll get it out of the way. I'll talk about the light parts 1 and 2. Probably, in my opinion, the heaviest moment in the band's discography. That Joba verse, both of those Joba verses are difficult to listen to. They are so raw. They are just so vivid. He describes his emotions like with no, just as they are. No sugarcoating. No, just it's raw. It's heavy. It's difficult to listen to, but they are some of the best verses in the band's discography because of that. Despite the fact they're hard to listen to.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to talk about this album without mentioning that. So I thought I'd mention it right off the bat so I can get it out of the way and mention some other things that I do like about this album. Um, I will say the fact that it's so sort of, in a way, I guess you could say all over the shop. Although I feel like that's a negative way of putting it. It does feel very diverse in its ideas. I
Yeah.
think that is a bonus. I think the band really kind of showcase a lot of different ideas, a lot of different. They kind of call back to a lot of previous periods in their discography, all in one album, and I think this does kind of add to the last album feel of the album for me. How many times do they say album in that sentence? um, yeah, and I do think it's an important moment in the band's discography in retrospect, even more so, given it's their last real album. Spoiler alert. Um, and honestly, it's a great send off. It does have some weaker moments, but the highlights are brilliant, up there with the band's best. It showcases the band's diversity in a very great way. I yeah, I guess I just wish we got to hear Joba happy again. You know.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think yeah, and it's probably never going to happen again,
Mm-hmm.
considering what the last two albums are. But yeah, before we get into those albums, just want to mention my score for this. I gave it a light 8.
Mm-hmm. Same.
A. Best tracks though, I like a fair amount of tracks in this, but I suppose best ones. Hold on, I'm just pulling up the album from Spotify.
All good.
Just
All
give me
good.
a second.
I can go with mine. I have them written down.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, my favorites are Buzzcut, The Light. I'll say part 1 and 2 here. And Don't Shoot Up the Party. My least favorite is Count on Me.
Okay, so my favorite tracks on it are Buzzcut, Chain On, Bankroll, The Light Part 1 and 2, Windows, and Don't Shoot Up the Party. If I have a least favorite, it's probably Count on Me.
Yeah, I mean,
I
obviously.
remember you did. I remember you really liked it a
It's
lot
no,
after
it's.
it
I
came
think
out.
it's fine, but it's just so far and above the worst track here. It's like a 6 on an album full of 8s and 9s and 10s.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, that leaves us with the final two Brockhampton albums, and we're going to start with the first one that we want to discuss here, and that is The Family. And yeah, both these albums came out the same time, and they're said to be the final two Brockhampton albums, which I think at this moment in time is kind of set in stone. And The Family, I feel like, is less of a Brockhampton album and more an album about Brockhampton
It's not less of
because
that. That's exactly what it is.
okay, yeah, it is there. It's more or less a Kevin Abstract solo album, and it's just him kind of talking about Brockhampton and just kind of some of the petty drama that ensued, like during the band's tenure, kind of releasing like a lot of this kind of like these emotional hardships that led to the band's breakup, and all doing it over these kind of like early Kanye inspired Chipmunk soul beats. And I do think the emotions are valid, and there are some interesting things to note from Kevin's perspective that like we never really knew about beforehand. But ultimately, like it feels like a bit of a failure of an album in the sense that it just feels undercooked, underdeveloped, and kind of an album that wasn't really made with care. because like obviously I feel like these last two albums, I think everyone knows at this point, these were basically albums that were made as obligations to their contract with RCA and were just released just so Brockhampton would be done and over without the contract. And the only time a Brockhampton member is really on this album, aside from Kevin, is Bareface, and it's only on the final track. And I do think there are tracks that are good on this album. I think Big Pussy is still very good, and there's some really good beats on this thing. But a lot of the time, there are tracks that just don't leave any impact because of how undercooked they are, because of just how not great they are, and generally because I just think I just think some of the shit that Kevin says in this is just kind of petty, in a sense, and like it just doesn't really translate well. I think the great tracks are great, and I think that the content makes the album. But honestly, it's an easy contender for Brockhampton, one of Brockhampton's worst albums, and for me, it's actually my least favorite Brockhampton album. The Family is like it's an okay album, but like it's just so much shit surrounded the band at this point that it's just an obligation, and just some of it comes off as a bit petty, if you get me.
Mm-hmm. I think in the years since it was released, I think my feelings for this album are a bit more positive. I think when it was released, I was just really sour that this was a Kevin Abstract solo album branded as a Brockhampton album.
I still am sour about it.
Yeah, but now that we understand the dynamic, and that the fact that the band weren't going to be making another album and they legally had to release something, I feel like this is probably the best case scenario what we got. I don't see what the other scenario would have been. The band would have gotten sued by RCA, and or they forced themselves to get into a studio. I don't know. It's
I feel like
definitely
actually, now that I think about it, if they forced themselves into a studio like together and make an album, I think honestly it might have been a fucking disaster.
yeah, who knows. Yeah, so it's an album by Kevin. It's a Kevin Abstract solo album about Brockhampton, and it's fine. It's fine. I think a lot of the ideas are half baked, but considering it's an obligation, I think again a bit of a best case scenario. It's a really shitty situation, and I think the band did what they could. And I will just say that I do think that perhaps time might be kind to this project, because as the years go by and Brockhampton seem more of like a distant memory, I think it might feel like a bit more of a retrospective of sorts. I think that the closing track definitely does already, and yeah, I think it's okay if you take it for what it is, a Kevin Abstract album that he was legally obliged to label as a Brockhampton album. Then it's fine. It details kind of the emotions that were kind of brewing with the band as it came to a close. But again, to call it a Brockhampton album is a stretch, and it's just an obligation on our end to include it as one because it's labeled as one.
Of course. And yeah, for me it's like strong 5, light 6.
Light 6.
Okay. And yeah, my favorite tracks from it were Big Pussy, The Family, and Brockhampton. Worst track is Basement.
My favourites were Take It Back, Big Pussy, and Brockhampton. My least favourites were Any Way You Want Me and My American Life.
All right, and then that moves us on to the next of the final two albums, and that is TM, stands for The Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And this album's blatantly leftovers from fucking from Roadrunner, and they already released the deluxe, which was leftovers from Roadrunner, so we were just kind of left with this, and
leftover of the leftovers.
Leftover of the leftovers. But I somehow like this a bit more because it actually feels like a Brockhampton album more than The Family. But then again, it's still like the same situation with The Family. It's very undercooked, very like half baked, and obviously an obligation of an album. There's some left field ideas like on Man in the Moon, but there's also kind of a mix of some bangers and some somber cuts. And there's maybe a couple of tracks that I do really like from it. But there are some tracks in this that are definitely very not good, and it's easy to see why they were left on the cutting room floor. But obviously, there isn't too much to say about it. If you know what Roadrunner sounds like, you're going to get an idea of what The Mountain sounds like. And again, like obviously it's leftovers, like they're half baked. They're just kind of ideas that were thrown together, thrown out to the public as an obligation, so they don't get sued by RCA. And while I do like some tracks, there's a lot of it that it doesn't really hit. But I feel like I like this album a bit more because it actually has all the members on it rather than just Kevin. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I prefer the family just because I guess there is a bit of a disconnect there. I feel like I'm listening to Kevin Abstract album, so I don't have the Brockhampton expectation. But with this, it's just I find this one harder to listen to because all the members are all on this. It is the whole band, but yeah, it's just so clearly an obligation. It's so clearly a bunch of ideas that were just put together. It's just a bunch of undercooked ideas that were sellotaped together, basically. It almost feels like some of those posthumous albums that you get from X or other rappers, except no one died in this case. They just broke up. In that, yeah, it just feels like they took a few snippets, a few ideas they had, and just put them together into an album just because they had to. It is, in my opinion, a really bleak way to finish off the discography. But then again,
You're fucking telling me, bro.
yeah, it is an obligation, and just because the family feels more earnest, feels more like an actual album that was more thoroughly conceived and more thought out, more emotion was put into it. That's why I prefer that one. This one really is just a slog to listen to because it's I mean, I think it's safe to say that even the band would have no love for this record whatsoever. It's just kind of there. It exists, and as far as I'm concerned, Roadrunner was their last album.
Yeah, I'm in agreement.
Yeah.
These last two albums didn't happen. It was Roadrunner. That was the last one. Okay.
It was just I blame RCA.
I
Have
blame
let them off
RCA
the
as
hook.
well.
I mean, they signed a contract, nothing. They should have let them off the hook still.
I mean, don't care. It's big label. Don't give a shit. Fuck you. But yeah, best tracks in the family for me were like FMG, Man in the Moon, and Keep It Southern. Yeah, worst track is Animal, and I think I gave this like a same score as the family. Strong 5, light 6.
My favorite track, only one really that I care for at all, is Man on the Moon. The rest are just like the definition of like a light 5 out of 10. That I worst tracks, I have to give it to Listerine. That shit is probably the worst song
Yeah,
they've ever released. It's
Listerine
so
fucking
fucking
sucks, to be fair.
garbage. I also really don't like Duct Tape. Overall, very light 5. Like it just about clinches a 5 out of 10.
Okay, fair enough. And with that in mind, that is the Brockhampton Discog Dive. Woo! We've done it. First of the format. Let's go. But
I want to say real quick. Listen to the unofficial version of Puppy on YouTube. You can find it. I think Kevin Abstract even tweeted it out when it was made. It's like a fan edit, and so that kind of makes it official because it's good. It's very good, and I don't want people to miss out on it.
Okay, I'll definitely listen to it. But yeah, do you want to give like a top 3 or what's the deal with these?
Top 3 albums.
Yeah, because like if we're doing these,
do,
I
yeah.
want to kind of clump the saturations as one thing. So like if I was to do a top 3 for me, like it would be probably the Saturation trilogy, then Ginger, then Roadrunner.
I feel like separating them is a bit more interesting, surely, because
oh god, you're gonna
obviously
kill me.
we'd have the same number 1 if it's.
You're gonna kill me.
I feel like it's what the people want to see.
Okay, fine, go.
Number 1, Saturation Tree. Number 2, Iridescence. Number 3, Saturation 2. Narrowly.
There we go. Okay. All right. So my number 1, Saturation 2. My number 2, Saturation 3. My number 3, Ginger.
Okay. This is right off the bat. this is just off the dome. Would you maybe like a top 5 to 10 best songs in your entire discography?
Oh, that's gonna be very off the dome for me.
Yeah, very off the dome. We'll preface this as very much off the dome.
Very much off the dome. Very much. Okay, I'm looking at the playlist.
I'll go off the dome.
Okay.
I'll go Heat.
Yeah,
I'll
I'm going
go
with Heat as well.
I'll go Lamb.
I would go Gold.
Gold. The only other on off Sat one I'd go for is Face, maybe.
I'd probably go. I was gonna say Star, but then there's a load more Brockhampton tracks that I want to mention.
Okay,
So
I won't mention Face actually. I'll just mention Lamb and Heat, because there's
Okay.
a lot more to get through.
Yeah. I suppose off of Sat 2, I'd probably take like Swamp and Queer and Sweet.
Sat 2, I'll probably just take Junkie and Sweet. Maybe Summer actually. Maybe I'll take Summer.
Of Sat 3, I will take Sister Nation and Boogie.
On Sat 3, I'll take Sister Nation, Alaska, Boogie.
I'll take Jauvert from Iridescence.
I'll take Chauvert and Wait. We're probably over 10. It doesn't matter. It's all fun and games.
Probably. Fuck it. No, I actually wouldn't consider any tracks from Ginger in top 10, even though I do love Ginger.
I wouldn't either. This is what I meant.
Maybe Dearly Departed, but like that would get nearer to
it has highlights, but this is exactly what I meant. Like,
yeah,
it doesn't have those 10 out of 10s.
I think closest for me would probably be Dearly Departed.
Yeah.
Then maybe on Roadrunner, probably The Light, and then maybe Buzzcut as well.
I think only The Light. I think Don't Shoot Up the Party would make top 15. And then
like no tracks off The Family and TM.
We got through that.
We should probably just do this like next time we do one of these.
Yeah, we should probably make the list.
Probably that would actually be very helpful. But actually, I was looking at the playlist. I forgot to say at the beginning of the episode, we have like a Spotify playlist that we made of some of our favorite Brockhampton songs. It's a 3-hour playlist, but compiled of some of our favorite Brockhampton tunes. We picked them ourselves, and it's in the description if you all want to check it out. So yeah.
Hell yeah.
And I suppose with that in mind, do you have any final remarks before we do the outro?
Just let us know what you think of the new format. If there's anything you think we could do to improve it or add on to it, just let us know. And let us know how we did. Please be nice.
Yeah. Please be nice. Don't tear us a new asshole. But yeah, all feedback is welcomed. And on top of that, like if there's any artists that you feel like suggesting that we think would be good enough to do one of these episodes in, then let us know in the comment section. We have like a whole list of them to do anyway, but like always open to suggestions. There could just be something out there where we have a fucking lightning bolt moment. But yeah, I suppose we can just end it right there. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. I've been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Discord in the description as well.
Oh yeah.
MickyT, Nostalgia, Brockhampton, forever.
Peace and love.
Peace.
I can't click on stop recording. I'm going to keep this in for the funny.